My name is Daryl Comic. I'm the president of Calgary Lougheed Constituency Association and was one of the producers of an Injection of Truth town hall last night. I'd just like to welcome everyone who is here and those who are watching us via stream again today. It seems that that's the way everyone wants to go. No one wants to show up anymore, except of course the people from Alberta View and Western Standard. Thank you so much. With me today, Dr. Mark Trozzi, Dr. William Mackis, Dr. Chris Shoemaker, Dr. Byron Bridle, and Dr. David Speaker. The reason for our media conference this morning, and most people would do it at the beginning of an event, but given that our event was about answering a question, and that question was, who can explain, or why can we explain the amount of unexplained deaths in Alberta children? And yesterday I had indicated that I had made a mistake, that the number of unexplained deaths was not 350% as we had stated. It's actually 3,328%. And so I apologize for the mistake, but it was we couldn't believe it when we did it. And I made a mistake with the decimal point. So it's actually 3,328%. Now someone says, Daryl, you made that number up. I did not make that number up. I wish I did. That number comes from AHS data, to which we have posted on our website at injectionoftruth.ca. What I would like to do today is allow each of the speakers who were at the event last night. I'd like to thank the 18,000 people who watched it on the stream and the 550 people who were in the room last night. It was a remarkable evening. It was the first opportunity for political party representatives, being Calgary Lougheed, UCP, to ask socially relevant questions that so many of our constituents are saying, what is going on? Why is no one talking about this? What we wanted to do is create a platform for science to speak and not be silenced. If you had all saw the event last night, you will see that it was data-driven. It was based on science. It was not based on opinion or innuendo. And there were many calls to action, and we can talk about those at the very end. So why don't we start on the left, Dr. Trozzi.
So this is with regards to why is there such an increase in unexplained deaths in children in Alberta. So, well, I think there's a variety of factors to that, because when I looked at the figures, they do go back to 2020. So 2020 was before the injection. So what was happening in 2020? And what happened with children in 2020 was a violation of their immune systems. So lockdowns, closing schools, closing the parks, shutting down exercise and sports, and getting them out of the sunshine, all extremely damaging to their immune systems. We know that, for instance, with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2, children had zero statistical risk of serious disease. Children had very few ACE2 receptors in their upper respiratory tract, which means they barely get sick if they get sick at all, but they do meet the virus, and that allows their innate immune system to train itself so that they're fit for life, so that for the rest of their life they'll be synchronized with the viruses that exist when they're small children, when they're born, and then through life they can just keep up through just healthy living. So that damaged their immune systems so badly that by the fall of 2020, in all the countries that had heavily injected, or no, sorry, all the countries that had locked down, the hospitalization rate for RSV, so for a different infection, was up 700% on average. So you had 7 times as many kids by late 2020, 7 times as many kids were hospitalized with a completely different infection, and that was because of the damage to their immune system. So, and then when you talk about deaths, you know, unexplained deaths is an unusual category. That I don't think that accounts for all the deaths. But then I think for me, the much bigger assault then is when we began injecting kids. And as I pointed out last night, you know, the United Kingdom data, which was available at the end of March in 2022, that showed, depending on the age group, dramatic death associated with the injections in children. So children don't die much in our society. We live in a society where death of children is luckily a very unusual thing. However, when you look at that data, and you know, you can look at different age groups. One of the age groups that really stood out was the 10 to 14-year-olds. And if you compare triply injected children in the UK data with kids that had none of these injections, the death rate was 8,200 percent higher. In other words, your child was 82 times as likely to be dead as an uninjected child if you gave them the full round of 2 shots in the booster. So I think those are a couple of the big factors that account for more dying among our children. The damage to their immune systems in 2020, and then some of them, unfortunately, have actually been injected with this extremely toxic and dangerous genetic experiment.
Thank you, Dr. Trosi. Dr. Makis.
Thank you very much. I've been tracking the died suddenly phenomenon since the end of 2021, so I've been at this for many years. I've reported on my social media over 5,000 sudden deaths, a lot of them children. I first started noticing this phenomenon in late 2021 when Canadian doctors were mandated COVID vaccines. So every doctor in Canada had to have at least 2 vaccines and had to show proof of vaccination. We had that in Alberta. We actually had AHS CEO Verna Yu implement a very aggressive vaccine mandate. And AHS workers had to fill out a form that gave AHS access to their personal information so that AHS could then confirm that they were compliant with that mandate. And doctors started dying suddenly. They started, young doctors in their 40s, 50s, started dying in their sleep, started dying while jogging, playing sports. And this phenomenon really came to public's attention in mid-2022. As I started tracking more and more doctors' sudden deaths, what happened was that the mainstream media came after me and tried to shut down all discussion of sudden deaths. So you had the Toronto Star doing hit pieces, Global News, many of the mainstream media, Reuters, Associated Press as well, were doing fact checks saying this was misinformation, disinformation, and that this was not happening. In late 2022, what I saw was I started seeing children dying suddenly. And I was very surprised by this because, again, it's not something, as Dr. Trosi pointed out, children don't just die, healthy children don't just die for no reason. And when I started looking into why children might be dying at really unprecedented rates, what I realized was that in early 2022, we had a rollout of the first 2 doses of COVID vaccines for children 5 to 11 years old. And at the same time, we had a rollout of booster shots for children 12 to 19 years old. They didn't need booster shots. But we had this massive rollout, hundreds of thousands of children in early 2022. And by the end of 2022, we had the deadliest flu season with the most pediatric deaths we had ever had in Canada. And you will see those mainstream media articles talking about, the worst flu season we've ever had, and all the doctors were baffled. Well, we knew by 2022 that there was a phenomenon called negative vaccine efficacy. And negative vaccine efficacy means that when you had your COVID-19 injections, after a few months, you are more likely to get infected with COVID-19 than someone who's unvaccinated. Well, this phenomenon of negative vaccine efficacy was happening in kids. In fact, when I pointed this out on Twitter in March of 2022, I was banned for 1 year. My account was suspended, terminated, I was censored and silenced, and I was only brought back by Elon Musk's team a year later. So, because they didn't want any interference with the rollout of the vaccines in children 5 to 11 years old. I specifically called for children 5 to 11 years old to not be injected with these products in March of 2022, and within hours, I was suspended and terminated. So, I've been watching this for several years now, and I think children's immune systems have gone through multiple assaults. As Dr. Trosi pointed out, we've had the lockdowns, the masking, that contributed to an assault on children's immune systems, but then we compounded that assault with the COVID vaccines. And not just the first 2 doses, but the continued issuance of booster shots for children that didn't need them. We know that there's a complete change in the immune system, the shift to IgG4, which completely screws up their immune systems by the 3rd shot. And yet, we have this continued push by AHS and other health institutions of these injections that are damaging children's immune systems. And we had healthy children dying of influenza. We had healthy children dying of strep. of sepsis, of meningitis, at numbers we had never seen before. And if you go back and look, we had the worst flu season in 2022. Again, we had the worst flu season in 2023. And it's because children's immune systems are being damaged, and some of these children, unfortunately, are dying.
Thank you, Dr. Makis. Dr. Speaker. Your turn.
Okay.
I caught you by surprise going down there, sorry.
Yeah, I was hoping.
I know, I wanted Dr.
last.
Shoemaker to go last this time.
Totally up to you.
I've looked so far at 38 vaccine vials myself, and the more we look, the more bad the things we are finding in these vials. So the lipid nanoparticulates itself and the spike is toxic. These shots, thanks to Dr. Friedel, don't stay at the site of injection. He learned this early on, and that helped us go, something isn't right here. The lipid nanoparticles throughout the body, they inject into our cells in the cytoplasm. High amounts of modified mRNA. It's been modified with N1 methyl pseudouridine. All of and that causes ribosomal frame shifting, and so the spike, some of it is full length in size, some of it's shortened, some of it's half length or quarter, and so all of these different spike sizes as giving a off target immune response. There's also in there high amounts of DNA, up to 187 billion copies per dose. And that at first Pfizer did not disclose to Health Canada that plasmid DNA contains SV40 promoters and enhancers. So SV40 promoter knocks out the cell's P53 and drives cancer. The SVB40 enhancer on a DNA fragment in the cytoplasm in a non-dividing cell, which has a clear envelope moves those fragments into the nucleus and will integrate into the genome. There is into all of that DNA impacts the C gas sting immune pathway. There is also in there double stranded RNA, DNA hybrids, and so I could let go on, but the main point is that each facet of this vaccine in some way can cause harm to her health and must be stopped.
Dr. Bridle.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Darrell Comic helped organize and arrange this event, and I thank him and the Honorable Eric Bouchard for inviting us here to have an opportunity to share with you, a lot of important information from the scientific literature. So in terms of this question of why the excess deaths are elevated in children, I want to point out there's lots of data from all around the world that supports this idea. The global population is much less healthy now than we were 4 years ago. And we have to ask the hard questions, why is that? So just before flying out here from Ontario, I was reading data being discussed in the British Medical Journal about Canada, asking why excess deaths are elevated in all age groups across the entire country. And again, and I can't point this out, so when we're talking about elevated deaths across all age groups, to me the most egregious demographic that's occurring in is the children, because there's no question that when it came to risk-benefit analyses, we have to understand COVID-19 was less dangerous to our children than the flu, and we have never lost our minds over the flu, the annual flu like we have with COVID-19 when we look at the response. So in other words, what are the possible reasons why childhood deaths may be elevated? I would say it's bad science. Any which way you slice it, it's bad science. So you're going to hear people who argue, well, this is because of COVID-19. It demonstrates how bad COVID-19 was. Well, let's remember, the favored hypothesis now, based on all of the testimonies we've seen and the data, suggests that the SARS coronavirus 2 was the result of gain-of-function research, right? So if that's the case, that's horrible science. Gain-of-function research needs to be abolished around the world, and it's continuing to this day. Then one can argue there was a failure in science in terms of the ability to contain this virus. Looks like it came from the Wuhan Virology Institute. That's a biological safety level 4 facility. Clearly there were failures in containment. That's another failure of science. And then there's the way we responded and treated our children. We ended up developing very poor quality products that are so far from meeting Canada's definition of an ideal vaccine that it's very difficult to still keep them under that umbrella term of vaccine. We locked down our children. One of the things that I need to, before we rolled out the COVID-19 shots, we locked down a lot of children across Canada for up to a year and a half. We isolated them from other individuals, from their friends, from their family, from the microbial world. And I can tell you, as a viral immunologist, an associate professor of viral immunology, the vast majority of the maturation and development of the immune system occurs between birth and the age of 6 years of age. And during that's a critical time for the immune system to learn to regulate itself. And we know that if children are not properly exposed to the microbial environment during that time frame, this can impact their immune system and render them much more susceptible to things like autoimmune diseases, allergies, and asthma, diseases that of a dysregulated immune system. And then, of course, we did roll out these shots, which were not needed in these children when you do a risk-benefit analysis. And data that's just emerged through a Freedom of Information request from The Center for Disease Control in British Columbia has revealed that in their own internal analyses, they found that the COVID-19 shots were at least 16 times more dangerous than the flu shots. And again, let's put that in perspective. COVID-19 was much less dangerous to children than the flu. So there was no rationale. And others have done a great job of highlighting specific concerns about those shots and potential mechanisms of harm that they can generate. So what I would say is we can't afford, if we want to stop this and get our children back to being a healthy population again, we can't respond the same way again when disease, so-called disease X, that unknown virus comes, you know, whatever that virus turns out to be. We need to execute. Remember, we had a national pandemic response plan that was thrown out when the COVID-19 pandemic was declared. We need to dust off that plan and execute it. That plan, if you look at it, called for what's called compassionate quarantine of the high-risk demographics, which for COVID-19 were the frail elderly with multiple chronic illnesses. It didn't call for the lockdown of children and masking our children and forcing or coercing them into getting shots, or coercing their parents and having them receive COVID-19 shots. And remember the declared goal at the beginning of this COVID-19 pandemic was to achieve herd immunity, and we lost that opportunity by how we treated our children. Our children, had we let them interact with this virus, this comes down to something that was completely ignored throughout the past 3 years and has hurt our children horribly by not recognizing the validity of naturally acquired immunity. We have caught that was one of the biggest reasons why we ultimately caused massive harm to our children, right? They had the ability to respond very effectively to this virus. We know that naturally acquired immunity is superior in every way, shape, and form as compared to the very subpar immune responses induced by these COVID-19 shots. And that would have given us a huge swath of our population that could have really helped us move towards that goal of herd immunity. It was a disastrous way we responded to this, and we can't do that again for the sake of our children.
Thank you, Dr. Bridle. Dr. Shoemaker.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this program that's allowing us all to speak. Dr. Bridle, I compliment you on reminding us all that we had a Made in Canada program. We have expert scientists in Canada. There was a program that has been understood for 15 years leading into COVID is what is the correct thing to do if there's a viral kind of pandemic. And the things that should have been done weren't. We rejected our scientifically Made in Canada program as to how to legitimately handle a viral pandemic. And by doing the opposite, by listening to what the WHO and others told the Canadian scientists, you must do it this way. So in the end, Canada Science made decisions to throw away our 15-year researched proper way to handle a viral pandemic and accepted an unacceptable way of doing it. Wait for a vaccine and use a vaccine while the pandemic is going on. You don't do that. You just don't do it. You don't give a vaccine for something when it's still raging in society. You have to let it go for a year and a half. Vaccination programs only occur when things are quiet. You don't treat for rabies during some kind of new rabies that comes in and let's try to treat it suddenly. No, you use it quietly when the world is quiet. That's when vaccines are legitimate. And that's when safe vaccines are legitimate. What was so unsafe about this vaccine, and Dr. Troese has alluded to this genetic affecting and immunologically damaging shot, because it has damaged our immune shot to take this, what it does is it makes you more likely to physically get the disease. You're wrecking your natural immune system, and all the studies from Cleveland Clinic and others have shown you're 5 times more likely to get COVID difficulties if you've been COVID vaccinated at 4 or 5 times. Why on goodness name's earth would we have done this? The other thing to comment about the percentages, this huge number, you were a bit surprised when it wasn't just 350%, it was 3,328%, or 33.28 times increase in this index. And it's consistent with the British data. The British data showed 82 times, 8,200%. And that was in an experimental test when the 2 groups were separated. So the kids who had no vaxes, they were at 0. There was no increase in their unexplained deaths. There was this unexplained death of 8,200%, 82-fold in the non-vaccinated arm of children. So here's why we get to a number in Canada, 33. Half the kids weren't vaccinated. Half were. So that number of 33-fold actually means the vaccinated children were getting 66 times more unexplained deaths, and the unvaccinated were not getting an increase in their death rate. And if you have 66 to 0, you get 33-fold. So it's the 33-fold is a broad number of all children in Alberta who have had that increased death overall in all of them. But I would predict if we further sub-analyze this, we'll find it's closer to 66-fold increase in unexplained deaths in vaccinated children and close to 0 in unvaccinated children. One last point, if I can address it, is all-cause mortality. All-cause mortality is a different statistic. How many more people are dying? In Western countries, it's between 35 and 45%. Let's call it 40%. A 10% raise in all-cause mortality in the world should only happen once every 300 years. It's a big deal. A 40% rise, statistically speaking, for death rate, all-cause mortality to go up in the world by 40% should happen once in the half of the length of the universe. Once every 3 billion years is the likelihood of all-cause mortality going up 40%. I leave it for the world to decide, has there been something that's happened in the last 4 years that has given us a 1 in 3 billion year event?
Thank you, Dr. Shoemaker. All right, I'm going to allow everyone a few questions. The young lady from Alberta Views so patiently sat through 3.5 hours of scientific data last night, so I'm sure you have a couple questions.
Yes. Okay, so my first question is for
Your name
anyone.
again, sorry?
Katie,
Katie.
Alberta Views.
Thank you, Katie.
Anybody can answer this, but what do you think the government stood to gain from the increased child deaths and also the vaccine rollout?
I don't think they had anything to gain. I don't think the government planned for any of these things to happen. That's what I think. It's a short answer, but I don't think they thought about gaining or losing. They thought they were doing the right thing. The bottom line is they did the wrong things.
And if I could jump in there too, I mean, someone had something to gain.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of our society. We've seen the largest profits in the history of products, and those profits have been made off these injections, these genetic injections which have been wrongfully labeled vaccines, in my opinion. How did that happen? I don't think people in our government decided to kill the children and kill the people. I think there was a lot of negligence, professional negligence, because I was able to study the data, as were others. Before these injections were even rolled out, we were able to study the emergency use authorizations, the initial clinical trials, and they were a disaster. The World Health Organization is funded in two ways. It's funded by taxpayers around the world like us, and it's funded by private interests. Most notably Bill and Melinda Gates, the Gavi Foundation, and associations with Big Pharma. If you look at the conflicts of interest and the connections between the WHO and these other entities, there's profound corruption going on. Voluntary donations, in other words, the donations given by these billionaires, come with the capacity to direct what the WHO does. So your tax dollars that go through the Canadian government, the WHO, which should be cut off, there's no say as to how it's spent. But the contributions of Bill and Melinda Gates, Gavi Foundations, and others comes with conditions. So they can say, we're going to donate this large amount of money. This is how it's going to be used. And that turned the WHO into a tool against the world. It became a conduit through which controllers of the WHO could use the WHO to mandate to all the countries that are members of the WHO, which are essentially all countries, 194, could mandate things like lockdowns, like masks, like forced injections of these genetic experiments. So who had something to gain? Mostly is the people that controlled the WHO. However, there was another dark side to this, which is because of that influence, what we've experienced through the last 4 years is any scientist, doctor, nurse that went along with this, now they may have themselves been injected with this material, which I think that's a terrible loss as an individual. However, going along with this paid well at any level. Look, for instance, at Dr. David Fissman. Look at the book Fissman's Fraud. And you can look at others like the Ferguson that created the modeling to justify this, which was all junk science. Anything that was done by a doctor or a scientist that supported the agenda profited. If you published an article that was absolute garbage, that said masks are a great idea, these shots are safe and effective, you got published, you got funded. A lot of people got rich downstream by going along with it, by supporting it, by promoting it. If you did not, and we know this all personally, as do thousands of doctors and nurses across this country to some degree, if you, for instance, said, hey, look at the ingredients, that's not a vaccine, that was punished in the end by stripping away your license as a nurse, your license as a doctor, you were fired from universities. So I think that's how the money train of the COVID agenda has operated. Now, what's at the thoughts at the people at the top of this? I know we have some in our country that are more aware of what they're doing. We know that the World Economic Forum is heavily embedded in Canadian governments and institutions. What's in their heads? Is it just profit? Well, there's also a huge global power grab, because on the basis of a cold, a man-made cold, they've suspended human rights. So we've had a huge transfer of wealth. We've had a lot done to establish a global dictatorship, essentially. And if you look at the International Health Regulations amendments that just passed, if you look at the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty that's being worked on, they're structuring a world in which we're reduced to slaves. So I think that's what and who had to gain from what's happened.
Thank you, Dr. Troisi. Dr. Bridle?
Yeah, so some straight up facts that I just like to add. You know, as a scientist, I can comment on the science, and I'll leave the intent behind, you know, decisions that were made to other experts who are better equipped to deal with that, and some of these have been addressed here. So I would say, you know, that question, to get the proper answer to that, there's some people that you could ask that question to. And I think their answers might be very telling if you could get legitimate answers from them. So for example, if you ask why our pandemic preparedness plans were discarded from every single public institution across this entire country within the first week of the declaration of a COVID-19 pandemic, right? I think those answers might go a long way to addressing what you just asked. What was the rationale for that? As was already mentioned by Dr. Shoemaker, these had been put in place when there was no crisis. It was following the 2009 swine pandemic, you know, the swine pandemic flu, which burnt itself out. But government, and that initial response with all the fear they experienced, realized they weren't in a good position to respond quickly or in a coordinated fashion. So then after that burnt itself out, when there was no crisis, scientists got together and brainstormed, and a fabulous plan was put in place, right? We had a national pandemic preparedness plan, and every public institution was required to have one as well that knit itself into this federal plan. And in fact, at the head of that, I encourage everybody to go back and listen to interviews that were done with Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond from here in Alberta. He presented this plan, and when you look at it, it is a fabulous common sense plan. It was designed, again, in the absence of any crisis and looking at all the best available science, and importantly, this was done when the science had not been politicized. And the fact that that was thrown out, and if Canadians haven't seen it, there's a video that was recently leaked with Theresa Tam and a bunch of other public health officials from across Canada discussing the current situation with the avian flu. The one thing that stood out to me in this video that was leaked was Theresa Tam having the goal to tell all of these public health professionals from across this country that we learned a lot from COVID-19 and how to deal with outbreaks. But if it came to something like the avian flu, we are unprepared, we remain unprepared. Because that's a zoonotic pathogen, something coming from an animal. And so we have to kind of establish from the ground up again, take the basic framework of COVID-19, but build a new framework, a new structure around trying to figure out how do we respond in a coordinated fashion should the avian flu become a pandemic problem. And I can't emphasize this enough. Honestly, is she that foolish that she can't recognize that the plan that we had in place, our pandemic preparedness plans, were the result of a zoonotic pathogen? They're worried about the avian flu. Our plan was designed based off of our experiences with a swine flu. We aren't unprepared. What was just talked about, this global push for a global pandemic treaty or global pandemic accord, the entire rationale, if you look, the World Health Organization will tell you, the only reason why they need that is because countries like Canada responded in an unorganized and uncoordinated fashion. And they're trying to tell us as a population that if we want to make sure that we're safe for the real one next time, right, the big one next time, that we need to look to them. And they'll make sure they have a plan in place for us. They'll make sure that they can tell us how to respond quickly in an organized fashion.
Could I just? Sorry.
Yes.
I just want to say, that's like the pot calling the kettle black, because why did we function in an uncoordinated fashion and not use our own plan? It's because we were told to not do it by the WHO. And so now the WHO says, since the countries did an uncoordinated thing, by the way, it's what we told them to do, we really have to be put in charge of everything now. It really is the pot calling the kettle black, I think.
Yeah, you're right, absolutely. And that's the whole point. We don't need outsiders telling us how to respond. And we are not unprepared. We are not unprepared should this current avian flu develop into some kind of issue or whatever future disease X would be. All we need to do is take the plan that we had, dust it off, and we're ready to go, right? And that's what people have to understand here. So if you can figure out the politics behind that and that kind of decision making, that'd be great. And what I also appreciate is those of you who are here from the media, I refer to you as the integrity media. And I think it's important that we all call out the state-funded media. They were invited to this event. I've never seen such emotional triggering from the state-funded media as I have for this event. Starting from more than a month ago, they have published unbelievable hit pieces that are just pure and utter propaganda trash. And they made the life of the organizers of this event a misery for over a month leading up to this. They openly defamed all of the people speaking here by lying about us, misattributing our titles and our professions and so on. And not one of their so-called experts that they interview on a regular basis were willing to come here. I came here because they were all invited first. I want that made clear, right? And they're not showing up and they're not asking the questions. So I'd also put to you that another great way to try and figure out the answer to your question, go to Legacy Media and ask why they have created this state-funded bubble around as much of the Canadian population as possible and excluded anybody who will question the narrative. If you can get proper answers from them about that, I think that'll be very revealing in terms of what the true answers are to your question. And yeah, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Mackes.
I gave the National Citizens Inquiry last year a 3-hour testimony. In that testimony, I had reviewed the data that had been posted on the alberta.ca government website. In June of 2021, the Jason Kenney's government started posting data on the alberta.ca website under the heading vaccine outcomes. And one of the first things that the government posted was these vaccines have efficacy of more than 95%, and you could tell that Jason Kenney's government was very proud of the first 2 doses of the vaccine and probably genuinely believed that they were going to get us out of this pandemic. As the time went on, by January of 2022, you can see from the Alberta government's own data that the double vaccinated are doing badly, that they are getting infected with COVID-19 at 2 times or 3 times the rate compared to the unvaccinated. And something happened at that time, and that goes to your question. Something happened because around that time, we had the rollout of the booster shots in Alberta. And we had an Alberta Health Services executive, Vice President Dr. Mark Joffe, who's the current public health chief, put out a video, and he said, don't walk, run to go get your booster shot. At a time when the government knew and AHS knew that these shots were harming people, that they were damaging the immune systems of the double vaccinated. And Dr. Dina Henshaw's office started deleting data, bit by bit. They deleted the most incriminating data that showed immune system damage in the double vaccinated. They deleted one table, they deleted another table, and by the summer of 2022, they deleted the entire category of vaccine outcomes because they were so embarrassed by the data. But they pushed on with the booster shots. So I think questions need to be asked. They need to be asked of Alberta Health Services executives that pushed the shots knowing that the vaccines were damaging the immune systems of a vast portion of the Alberta population. And during that time from, let's say, early 22 or throughout 2022, as they were deleting data where they were basically not giving Albertans the information that they needed to make informed consent in terms of continuing to take the booster shots, they continued pushing the booster shots on the population. And we need to ask from Dina Henshaw's office, from Alberta Health Services, from the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta, who stood to benefit from this ongoing push in the population of booster shots at all ages when they knew that the shots were causing harm.
Just two things I want to add at this particular point before I allow your supplemental question. All of these doctors have come here on their own without compensation. They're all Canadian doctors. Okay, so we have gone and we have worked on the expertise that is in Canada. It's robust and it's strong. We did compensate everybody for their travel and accommodations. I just want everyone to understand the parameters of their participation. There was no speaker fees paid, and there was no inducements made to them for them to come. All right, Katie, a supplemental question?
Does it have to be related or can it be separate?
Sure. Go to your next thought.
I have a question for Dr. Schrozy. You said you were talking about innate immunity. Is that in children for all diseases or just for COVID-19? That children have innate immunity?
Yeah, so innate immunity, the innate immune system is a part of it, is a very important part of our immunity that is largely ignored by, certainly by the vaccine industry, and it's ignored in medical training. So at all the barriers where something would get into our body, our airway, our digestive tract, right there in the tissue. I mean, as soon as you come to that interface, be it internal or external, the skin, wherever that interface is between the external environment and our internal environment, you have an innate immune system. And the innate immune system is able to recognize many things that are non-self. So any cell that isn't one of my cells is non-self. And the innate immune system, we come at birth with a phenomenal innate immune system that can recognize lots of things that are non-self and initiate a process to eliminate them. And when you look at things like respiratory infections, including COVID or flus, the innate immune system does close to 100% of the immune response. So a child doesn't usually end up with the virus in their bloodstream because it's dealt with at the innate barriers. The adaptive immune system, and we have experts here in this more than myself, like Dr. Bridle and Dr. Speaker, but the adaptive immune system, if a pathogen, be it a virus, if it breaks beyond the innate immune system, if it gets into deeper tissue, the process begins where lymph nodes create antibodies against it, which helps support the immune response. They can also inhibit or interfere with the innate immune response. So that innate immune system that kids have, which is really the main defense against infections, all sorts of infections, again, something like rabies would be different because in rabies, there's a puncture of the skin and the infection is put into the deep tissue, right? So that's a different situation, but most of the infections that we face, the innate immune system does the heavy lifting. And so in the case of children's innate immune system, I mean, a child is born, should be breastfeeding, which gives it a lot of support to its immunity. And the children, you see, the pathogens are evolving. And the innate immune system and the full immune system needs to evolve as well. So, and as Dr. Bridle pointed out, the main training and the main initiating the immune system happens in the first few years of life. So when children are born, they actually need to interact. They need to face the viruses and pathogens that exist at that point in history. So they synchronize. So they become very quickly adapted to the pathogens as they exist. And then as we continue through life, as those pathogens evolve, our system can evolve with it. But when you obstruct that initial setting up, right, you cause a major weakness in the child's immune system. It's very hard to recover from.
Which of the reporters from the Western Standard would like to go first?
I'm going to keep you here for a while. How many children in Alberta died of all causes in 2023? And how many should we have expected? I mean, you've given us the percentages, but I'd like to know the numbers.
You had that chart.
I don't have to invite someone else
Yeah.
to begin, please, and yourself, because you've reviewed it
Yeah,
extensively.
I'll have to refer you to our website.
I knew you were going to say that. I was hoping you had.
No, and I want, because you're gonna quote the number, I want you to look at the actual specific number that's there, as opposed to me
Are
picking
we
the
talking about
number.
dozens or hundreds or thousands?
I think we're probably in the, Mike, do you recall that from the website?
Well, I know that we're, all excess deaths are over 15,000, and if you, yeah, it would be like probably about 10% of that, I think might be, again, that would be probably under 14.
The actual, I think, average number is supposed to be 1.6. I think that's the baseline number, 1.6.
I mean, you'll appreciate that actual numbers matter. If you've had one death in 1 year and two in the next year, you've had a 100% increase, but you actually only had 2 deaths.
Right.
So I'm trying to get some sense of how big an issue this is in this province at this time.
Well, just based on the numbers that we posted, the number is incredibly relevant because it's more than the average. And because there is a spike, which everyone can collectively look at the number of deaths, that was this tremendous spike, no one looked at the spike. So we happen to be talking about the actual number of deaths in children. But if you look at the number of deaths in seniors, it was over the top. But the reason that we specifically looked at the children is because we didn't want people to bias the conversation in advance by comorbidities or being old or having done enough time in life. And so that's why we focused on the youngest, healthiest population. So that, Mark?
Well, I can give you some numbers that unfortunately aren't Alberta numbers, so some UK numbers. But
Okay, well, I'll happily write them down, but why don't we have Alberta numbers, given that we're talking about.
But we do have the numbers of just.
I'm just saying, I don't have those on the tip of my tongue, and it is true that there's some great tables on the website. So forgive me, there's awful lot of numbers of the last years, and I don't have them memorized, so I wouldn't make them up. But there are some numbers that come to my mind that I can work with. And so, first of all, children don't die much. Death among children is very rare. So the increase in death is very impressive when you look in terms of percentages. So in other words, if you're looking at a group and you say, well, normally 2 children die and then you have 20 children die, that's a massive change. The UK data from the beginning of 2021 until March of 2022, so it's a 15-month period, in the UK, where they did track
I'm just trying to figure this out.
vaccinated or injected with this genetic experiment children and non-vaccinated. If you look at the number of deaths per 100,000, and you look at the number of deaths that were diagnosed as COVID deaths, in the uninjected children, you had 0.33 per 100,000. In the injected children, you had 100 deaths per 100,000. When you look at all-cause death, you had approximately 6 per 100,000 in that same age group of 10 to 14. And you had 500 in the triply injected. So the end result was that triply injected children in that 15-month period had a 0.33 to 100, that's about a 300 times rise, or 300% rise, and overall you had an 82 times rise in death. So the children were 82 times more likely to be dead of anything in that 15-month period if they were triply injected compared to those that had no injections. So the numbers are still small, but the percentage increase is extremely high.
So the Alberta Health Service, this is AHS data that you're working with.
Yes.
Well, though this was UK data I was
Oh,
mentioning, yeah.
This was, but
Yeah.
you are working with AHS data. It appears to tell the same story. They own that data, they're responsible for it. What is their explanation for the unexpected deaths?
They've given no explanation.
Have they been asked?
They were asked.
Was it a member of the media that asked, or?
No, we asked, Eric has asked the question. We've received no, it's not that they didn't give us a response, they gave no response. They did not answer the question, they gave no response.
How long ago did you ask?
In the last 2 months, we've been on the pursuit of it.
I mean, can we say that they refused to answer, or just that they?
They were indifferent to their own data.
They didn't see any significance.
No, everyone else on the planet does, but they don't.
Just a quick question.
And just to your point, if you recall back when we first, and this is news coverage that I'm recalling, when we had that amazing spike in unexplained deaths, it was the #1 cause of death in Alberta. Media covered that, but they never asked why was there so many? The number, they all reported on the number, as you're asking, but no one says why. And can someone follow up on why is that number not dealt with?
Just
Mr. Rath.
just a quick question, and I think this is sort of going forward. Some people may be aware we're doing a class action lawsuit on behalf of people that have been injured by these shots. I literally just came from a meeting with a mother whose 18-year-old son has just been diagnosed with pericarditis and myocarditis, and his cardiologist has told him he now has the heart of a 60-year-old. And of course, he had to get the shots to go to university and participate in his sport. Just last week, I was at my local golf club and I was chatting with one of the staff that worked there. She was telling me that she routinely now has to go for cardiac exams because no fewer than 4 girls that she knows that she plays hockey with at the university level have all been diagnosed with myocarditis following the shots and have told they can no longer play collegiate level sports, right? All of them were forced to take these shots to go to school. So what I'm wondering is, are we sitting on top of a bubble of potential future deaths from all of these young people who are now being diagnosed with myocarditis and pericarditis and vasculitis as a result of these shots? I was just wondering if any of you were tracking.
Are you okay with the answer, Nigel?
Can I just add to your question though, because this is something I was going to ask. I forget who it was, maybe it was Dr. Trozy who made the observation that the children's immune systems are compromised. Are they ever restored, or are they going to be, as this gentleman has said, carrying this through their whole lives? And we're going to have unexpected deaths in every age group for the next 70 years.
Unfortunately, I think so, and one of the reasons for that is the mechanisms. Now, it doesn't mean that we're giving up. We're developing ways for people to detox, to deal with elements of the toxicity of these injections that we can deal with. But there's so many different mechanisms. So for instance, when you think of very short term, is anaphylaxis. So there's something that happens very quickly. If you're going to have a profound allergic reaction to the injection, it's going to happen in the initial hours. If you make it through the initial days without anaphylaxis, your risk of anaphylaxis is over. That's one thing off the table. Right? Then you run into a variety of things, including the body starts producing spike protein in massive quantities if you get an intact injection. The spike protein has a variety of mechanisms of harming. One is it directly causes platelets and red blood cells to stick together. So you get into that clotting phase. You get this microvascular clotting, you get strokes, you get people with pulmonary embolisms. So there's another wave. But now that the body has produced a foreign protein, now a lot of your tissue looks like foreign tissue. So now you get into another wave, which is the immune system attacking the body. That can start pretty early, but we know that can keep going on for at least a year based on, for instance, Dr. Burkhardt's autopsies in Germany. And so there you get your myocarditis, you get your sudden kidney failure, you get somebody who's like, wow, how does this person suddenly have type 1 diabetes at 50 years old? That's unusual. Well, not if you have the immune system attacking the islet cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. etc. But then you get into another way, because as Dr. Speaker pointed out, this RNA isn't just the RNA for the most toxic part of the coronavirus, the spike protein. It's highly modified, and it has this strange letter. Instead of a uridine, it's got an N1 methyl pseudouridine. The reason for that is messenger RNA, our natural messenger RNA that our bodies use to instruct our cells to make protein, they last minutes or hours. This modified mRNA for this foreign protein lasts, we're still trying to figure out how long. 6 months, 8 months, we don't know. So that's why they did it, which, again, I've never supported these injections before the first one was given. But another result of that is when the ribosome is reading this messenger RNA, and you have this clunky, weird letter, this one uridine that's different, the ribosome skips. Like imagine you're playing a record and there's an odd mark. The needle skips. So what happens is it's producing a spike protein, that's toxic enough, but then it will suddenly skip and turn the other way, or it'll just cut off and produce that. So we're producing, in addition to, probably about, when you look at the smudges, the lab smudges, we're probably looking at 90–95% of what's produced is spike protein, but this other 5% is a wild collection of unknown random proteins. Every time you throw a random protein into the body, you create the possibility that that protein is going to resemble one of your proteins in one of your tissues enough that the immune response to that is going to be an immune response to that. And now you're triggering autoimmune diseases. So I think we can expect that to be a wave that moves forward, and we're already seeing that rise in all autoimmune conditions. Now remember, in Canada, if a doctor recognizes that what's causing this and says it, they lose their license. So you can get diagnosed with myocarditis, but you can't get diagnosed with myocarditis due to spike protein poisoning. You can get diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease, but you can't get diagnosed with lupus actually triggered by these injections. So that's the next wave. One of the other waves we worry about is something called prion diseases. When you create unknown proteins, those proteins have the capacity to cause other proteins to misfold, to change shape. And this is where you can get into long-range diseases that will resemble things like Jacob-Creutzfeldt disease, mad cow disease. So then you have a whole other long wave. And then as well as, Dr. Hodkinson has pointed out, all of our organs have residual capacity. So in other words, let's say everyone in this room has 90 to 100% kidney function. If we started reducing your kidney function through disease, now that might not help you at the Olympics, but you're not going to notice anything until your kidney function reaches a critical point where now your body becomes toxic because your kidney can't do its job. That's the same of all tissues, right? Including the brain, right? So that, because of a variety of factors, not the least of which is this profound ability, when they engineered this virus and the genetic code that corresponds to it, which is the genetic code injected into people to make the spike protein, they did something very strange. They eliminated an enzyme that's usually expressed on the surface of the spike protein called hemagglutinin esterase. And when you eliminate that enzyme, the end result is what would normally be a protective thing against coronavirus is that your blood cells, your platelets, and your red blood cells can do, becomes a weakness, and your blood cells and your platelets stick together, and you get all this microvascular clotting, right? Now, microvascular disease leading to dementia is a very common thing. And to some degree, I think most of us can anticipate it in our life. My odds of doing calculus at 90 are going to be not as good at 40 as they were at 40. And so what we can also unfortunately predict is that remember, you have a residual capacity. So let's say here you're at 100% brain capacity, and it's coming down gradually in life. And maybe by the time I'm 90, you'll say, boy, Grandpa's having trouble remembering things, but he's still got wisdom, thank God, we love him. But when you change that curve from this to this, now you can anticipate people being aged prematurely, so that you could say, hey, this person would have had enough microvascular disease in their brain, for instance, that we would say they're getting dementia at 90 or 80, but now we can anticipate that at 50 or 60. So I think, unfortunately, this personally, I mean, especially given how much we know about it, that this is still being recommended and pushed. I think it is a biological item. It does no good. It causes you, you're more likely to get COVID in the long run. But much worse than that is there's all these pathologies that it can create. So I think it can only be described as a biological weapon at this point. And unfortunately, whether by mistake or design, it's a very crafty biological weapon, because like what we saw in 2020, we saw that whatever people died of, it was most likely going to be diagnosed as COVID for a variety of reasons. And Dr. Litchke in Ontario, she lost her license partly because she wouldn't commit fraud on death certificates. There was a huge push because the billing of the hospital was much higher if the code was COVID. So we had cases, people crashed their motorcycle and the cause of death was COVID. So all these deaths from all these other things were all raked together into a pile and called COVID. It's like, wow, nobody died of influenza this year. Boy, this dropped, that dropped, that dropped.
Was that unfortunate practice sufficiently common to skew the figures? I mean, I'm sure it happened.
Oh,
Hugely.
oh no, it was huge in 2020. It was huge in 2020. You look at the data and you go, wow, look, here's your influenza deaths every year, and then they just disappeared. I mean, influenza didn't go away. But now you have a different thing going on. And remember, doctors who study and recognize and speak truth about this are still losing their licenses. So the doctors that are still in the system, they know. In Canada, you want to lose your license, just fill out an adverse event report. Just say, hey, this guy had a stroke 5 days after the injection. I think it at least might be due to the injection. You'll get in trouble. You'll be investigated. So now we have a situation where this injection causes so many different clinical outcomes. So you can come in with a stroke, you can come in with cancer, you can come in with severe COVID, you can come in with kidney failure. And the doctors are diagnosing and treating them all without understanding what's underlying, which is a very difficult situation. But none of it is from the shot. So 2020, you come into 2021, and the death rate goes up everywhere the injections are imposed, quite dramatically, as do fertility rates 9 months later. But on the official data, nothing to do with the shots, but clearly from the shot.
You've
I'd
hit a,
like to defer to my colleague here, who also has questions.
no, before you do that though, you've incited a whole bunch of people who want to comment. Dr. Speaker.
On this whole point of long-term health of
Mr. Speaker. Sure, thank you.
vets, I am really worried. The whole Hara work is Dr. Shoemaker shows that there are folk with heart damage that is asymptomatic, and in time will cause, symptoms the long term. As for the DNA part, there are vaccine-injured people who have not had COVID and are still experiencing spike 18 months or more after the shot, and we think most of this is because of genomic integration, and so these shots are shoving full-length spike into our own genomes. It's been shown in cell culture so far. We are looking for this in patient cells, and so if you have full-length spike in your genome, it sets up spike factor release. which which can make long-term toxicity and harm. One of my next things I'm working on is to look for this in sperm cells. So if you have DNA for spike in sperm cell DNA, and that sperm fertilizes as an egg, and that makes a offspring, there's a possible chance of every cell in that child's body making spike. So how can we remove this out? Well, spike we can detoxify. Once DNA is in your genome, where's it in the system? It's hard to find cells replicate, and it's like shoving food coloring in water. Once it's in, you're not getting it out.
Dr. Shoemaker.
I'm going to try to consolidate things that have just been said by Dr. Speaker and just recently by Dr. Trozy as well. One thing Dr. Trozy was saying was that multiple organs, it can happen subtly, repeatedly, and in multiple organs. And why would it be in multiple organs? It's of course because the shot does go everywhere, that's fully proven. And the plasmids and the lipid nanoparticles that it's inside of, that makes it preferential to get in two places in particular, the brain and the genetic system, ovaries and testicles. The brain and the ovaries and the testicles were always designed by the makers of this fake genome. It was designed to go maximally to those two tissues. Of course it goes to other tissues. Of course it goes to kidney and heart and the aorta and other organs as well. And it goes in an amount of 40 trillion, and it's 40 trillion in every shot. 40,000 billion factories go in with every shot. There's only 80 that go in with a shot of polio to assist you to become immune to polio. Why on earth did they pick the worst part of this genome to put in us? They didn't. And the reason that the worst part was picked was to go to as many places as possible and create as much harm as possible. And I would call it the fountain of aging, as opposed to the fountain of youth. This is the fountain of aging within us. And for some folks, it's just making their last 10, 11, 12 years difficult with tinnitus and odd discomforts and severe arthritis and some dementia and some renal failure. You know, little bits of problems here and there. But those little bits of problems are made to happen continuously because your immune system has been turned on its head. And the final comment to make about the immune system is that antibodies are very inefficient at fighting viruses. They are a signpost that you've had an infection, but it's not the antibodies that fight the infection. The things that fight an actual new infection coming into you is called T-cell immunity. T-cells are the crucial thing. T-cells are what actually fight an infection of any nature, including COVID. And to have damaged our T-cell immunity, and that's what has been found, T-cell rates and numbers drop massively over the 6 months after you have received this injection. So to have harmed T-cell immunity, which is part of that natural immunity system that Dr. Trozy spoke of, T-cell immunity is from your own natural abilities to simply be immune to things that are not you. And your ability to be resistant to things that are not you are damaged specifically by the COVID-19 pseudo-antibody, pseudo-vaccine. It's set up a number of things that damage your macrophages, damage your T-cells, and reduce your overall immunity to a number of diseases. I just wanted to emphasize that point for both Dr. Speaker and Dr. Trozy. Thank you.
Dr. Makis.
I do want to answer your question, and you asked specifically, when do you see immune damage, does the immune system recover? From the studies that I have reviewed, these are studies out of Denmark, out of Sweden. There's a study of over 800,000 vaccinated people the vaccine efficacy drops. As soon as you give a dose, the vaccine efficacy starts to drop, and it bottoms out around 6 to 8 months. So you could infer from that that the maximum immune damage is going to be approximately 6 to 8 months after your last shot. In fact, some of that data was used as a justification in the rollout of the booster shots, that you need booster shots every 6 months because the vaccine efficacy basically drops to 0. In fact, it goes under 0, which means you get negative vaccine efficacy, which means that now that is an evidence of immune system damage. Now it starts to recover. The curve actually starts to go up, and all the studies cut off at that point, right? Even the CDC data cuts off at around 6 to 8 months. So you get evidence of negative vaccine efficacy from CDC data, Denmark data, Swedish data. And what we saw from Alberta government data was that when we had, people have only had 2 shots. There was evidence by January of 2022 that the double vaccinated were doing the worst approximately 6 to 8 months after their last shot. That is when Dina Hinshaw's office started deleting data from the alberta.ca website. That's when AHS started pushing booster shots. That's when Dina Hinshaw's office started pushing booster shots. By the summer of 2022 in Alberta, we had data showing that the triple vaccinated were doing the worst. They were disproportionately hospitalized compared to how many triple vaccinated there were in the population. They were disproportionately in the ICUs, and they were disproportionately dying. They were the worst category in hospitalizations, ICUs, and deaths. And in the summer of 2022, Dina Hinshaw's office deleted all vaccine status data in the hospitals, and we never got that data again. Same thing happened in BC with Dr. Bonnie Henry. And within a week of each other, Alberta and BC governments deleted all that data showing that the triple vaccinated were doing the worst. At that time, the double vaccinated were doing better, but they were never as good as the unvaccinated, which means your immune system never recovers fully. Finally, by the end of 2022, we continued to get data from the Australian government. And the Australian government rolled out the 4th shot, and then we saw that the quadruple vaccinated were doing the worst. They were leading disproportionately in hospitalizations, ICUs, and deaths. The triple vaccinated were doing a little better, the double vaccinated were doing a little better. Of course, the best group was always the unvaccinated. And in December of 2022, the Australian government deleted all that data, and we never got to see the vaccine status of who was in the hospital again. So immune system probably starts to recover at 9 to 12 months. Long term, I have not seen any data to suggest that the immune system ever recovers fully. Certainly, the people who stopped after 1 shot, 2 shots, or 3 shots never do as well as those who remained unvaccinated.
Dr. Bridle.
Yeah, okay, so I'd like to just touch on several issues from my point of view. So first of all, to start right from the beginning with your question, I looked at the table that I saw. It was listing that the historical number of unexplained deaths in children, so that would be 0 to 18, was 14.4. So that's the average of the several years prior to the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic.
14.4 K per 100,000? Is that what you said?
So in that table, so that I'm not sure based on the table that I saw, that it didn't actually indicate. It just indicated 14.4. So it could be 14.4 total in Alberta, or it could be, like you said, per 100,000. That wasn't clear to me. So again, it's Alberta Health Services data, so I would refer to them in terms of what the units are, whether that's absolute number or per 100,000. But what I want to point out is, you see, to me that's unexplained deaths, and to me, honestly, what's more important is total deaths, right? And what we're referring to as excess deaths. So what I just want to point out is there's lots of data available out there, but one person who's been tracking this very closely, her name's Tara Moriarty from the University of Toronto. And so she recently put out data showing that, again, relative to the historical trends prior to the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, for 3 consecutive years, that's 2020, 2021, and 2022, Canada is up in terms of excess deaths by 1,000 deaths per week, right? So 1,000 more Canadians dying every week now than pre-COVID-19. So again, to me, that's the discussion we need to have, is why is that occurring? And the reason why I say total excess deaths, so this is the thing, deaths, it's like births. Those are two statistics that you can rely on as being quite accurate, because that's something that the government does track, quite carefully. Other data that we have related to COVID-19, honestly, it is a discombobulated mess, and we don't really know what to make of it. I'll give you an example in just a moment. But that's why deaths are important. So to me, the topic is, why are Canadians dying in greater numbers? Why are Canadians less healthy now than we were pre-COVID-19? And I think we need to get all scientists to the table to have those discussions. Now, I will point out, this includes 2020, which was before the rollout of the COVID-19 shots, right? That's why I say, to me, this involves bad science, period, right? If it's the virus, that's likely the result of bad science due to gain of function research, something that should never have happened, right? And people need to get held to account for that. Also, it's bad science that it wasn't contained in the laboratory where it was supposed to be contained. Either way, there is bad science involved here, and Canadians have been impacted. And then there's the rollout of the shots, right? So, because remember, this is what I want to point out. The narrative was that Canadians were dying in massive numbers in 2020. That's when all these deaths occurred, right? Massive numbers in 2020, where this horrible virus ripping through the population is what we were told, and the vaccines were the solution. But clearly, if deaths were elevated, excess deaths were elevated in 2020 and have continued to be elevated since then, it hasn't been the solution, has it, right? And could be contributing to the ongoing problem. And that's why we have to have these open and honest scientific discussions about what's going on. And so let me just give you an example. That's why people have focused on deaths. And so one of the problems is, if unknown deaths are up in children, obviously that's a concern. You want to know why, right? We shouldn't be having children dying and not knowing why. But of concern is what may be embedded in the known deaths. So again, if children are dying from myocarditis, and that myocarditis is caused by the shot, and I will tell you, if you look at any time there is a case, let's look at some of the famous athletes that suddenly collapsed. The Buffalo Bills player was a famous one. There's a trick there, if you look. Legacy media, or state-funded media, if you look at what they did there, they got cardiologists to come on. And all the cardiologists, what did they say? They all said the same thing. The cardiologists, they're not immunologists, they're not vaccinologists, they're not experts in vaccine. But every single one of them started off saying, I can assure you this had nothing to do with a vaccine. But now that we get to my area of expertise, which is cardiology, let me tell you, I can't tell you exactly what it is. It could be cardiac issue A, B, C, D, or E. We're not sure. I would like to see test A, B, C, D, and E, and F done. And I'd like to see all those data before I tell you definitively what I think the cardiac issue actually was. You see, because the science is complex. And when you're an expert in that science, you understand how complex it is, and it isn't easy to give easy, simple answers. What I can tell you as a vaccinologist is that when it comes to deaths associated with things like myocarditis and cardiac issues that are occurring, could it be due to natural infection with COVID-19? 100%, yes it could. Could it be due to the vaccine? 100%, yes it could. And you see, this is the thing. The narrative says we can only say that it's due to natural infection, and we can't say it's due to the vaccine, and we can't rule that out. And when it comes to numbers, figures, this is the problem. This is why people are focused on death. So get to this point, because let's look at people. We had the ticker tape of all news agencies. Every day we were exposed daily to cases of COVID-19. Let me use that as an example. The PCR test, a PCR test, it's a diagnostic aid. It is supposed to give one piece of information to put into the toolbox of a diagnostician, like the diagnosticians you see to the right of me here. And they're supposed to take into account epidemiological factors. Remember, COVID-19, the D in COVID-19 is disease. You can test positive for the virus and not have a disease. It was already mentioned, many children got infected with SARS coronavirus 2 and never got COVID-19 because they were able to clear the infection before they got the disease. So if we're talking about cases of COVID-19, you're talking about disease. People had to be sick. That means they had to have signs and symptoms. Yet we define the vast majority of our cases were based simply on a positive PCR test result. And as I can tell you as an expert, that might or might not mean that they had COVID-19. And we even have open admissions from where I live in Ontario, from our public health agency, where they have had to admit on many days, the vast majority, not the vast majority, on many days, the majority of hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths were not due to COVID-19. They now say it was due to some other clinical condition, but with COVID-19, and even that is misleading the public, because it's not with COVID-19. What they actually mean is with a positive PCR test result, which means they may or may not have had COVID-19. So you know what I mean? So when we put all this together, what it means is we have very unreliable statistics outside of these death statistics. And what is being agreed upon by all parties is their population is much less healthy now than it was pre-COVID, right? So there's been a breakdown in our health system, there's been a breakdown and damage to the health of Canadians in general. And now we need to get to the causes. And some of it, I do think, is COVID-19, and some of it is definitely going to be due to mismanagement, due to the shots, and other things that have been mismanaged in this, right? And that's why I would say, you know, I appreciate that we looked at here. One of the questions was based on unknown deaths, but again, excess deaths, can't rule those out. You know, again, if children are dying, so if they're dying from cancer, but that cancer was potentiated by a shot, right? We're putting it down as due to cancer, but it's actually cancer due to the shot, perhaps. Or it might be cancer due to the natural infection, yes. You know what I mean? But so we got to dig down to why this is happening. Because when you get to the total excess deaths, that's including the unknown, but it's also including the increase in the rates of cancer and the increase in deaths due to myocarditis and other cardiac issues, strokes, you know, blood clots, etc. And all of those could be contributed to by the natural infection, but also by the shots. Right? And that's why we need to have the open discussions, allow everybody to come to the table, not those that have been restricted to selling only, you know, a very narrow narrative that fails to capture this broader science.
Two seconds. I ran in the pandemic 2 COVID PCR labs. I have a PhD in the diagnostic field, and I confirm what he said on that is factual.
Sure.
I guess the point that we're making is we're asking for permission to have the conversation. We're saying, why is the conversation not occurring? And why have we not had an open dialogue about the potential harms and interpretations of what these statistics are? Because we only have the math now. And to trigger a reaction of having a conversation, and this is what Mr. Bouchard and I have been encouraging, is let us have that conversation by first admitting that the statistics show a problem. Yes, there's a problem. Once we have a problem, then we can have scientists then challenge why the problem may or may not exist. And what I respect most about all of these scientists and doctors here today, they did not come into this trying to agree with each other. You can even tell from their answers here, they do not agree with each other. But what they do agree with is that if they challenge each other's hypothesis or data, that we will have a better outcome for public health. And this refusal by all forms of government, and we're particularly pressuring the Alberta government to take action in this one particular area, because we realize that we are not going to be able to push the headwinds of the entire system. So we ask to protect the most vulnerable, the most pure, and the most relevant controlled group population, which is young people. Yeah. And that's what we're asking. You have another question?
So can I just say one thing that I think really helps clarify?
Sure. Yeah.
All this. The reason, okay, here's an example why we need this conversation. I see it in court cases. It's called judicial notice, where if Health Canada says something, then it must be fact, right? But as a subject matter expert like myself, I've got to go to court and I have to defend what I say, and I've got to show the data. I've got to prove that what I'm saying is correct. I've got to try and convince the court that I know what I'm talking about. But this is the thing. The reason why we need the discussions and all people present to share their ideas is because that fails. So I have seen over and over and over again, and the most recent one is again this data, these behind-the-scenes communication that were just released or obtained from the BC Centre for Disease Control. I want to highlight one thing from that. In their internal discussion, up to March 26, 2021, they had been accruing from their passive monitoring system which we know passive monitoring systems dramatically underestimate the number of unusual medical events that that occur following vaccination. But they were monitoring that. And then 1 week later, they went public. And what these communications showed is they had 144 severe adverse events that had been submitted to their passive monitoring system in British Columbia that they were all discussing internally. And when they went public with it 1 week later, that number was slashed to 26. And we now know from looking at this 1,312 page report, the way that, because you're looking at what happened, it was 144 in all your internal discussions. Do you know how they slashed it from 144 to 26 when they went public? They redefined a severe adverse event. And they redefined it by removing all kinds of very severe adverse events. Let me give you one example. Meningitis, inflammation, swelling of the brain, you know, the membrane surrounding the brain. That is not a non-serious event. And so so we can talk about the specific numbers for Alberta, for children, this. We could talk about these specific numbers and those specific numbers. At the end of the day, what I want to point out, that number 14.4 that I saw on the table, whether it's total or per 10,000 or 100,000 children here in the province, when I see our public health agencies failing to disclose the proper data, right, when they are withholding that, and not even withholding that, when they are manipulating data for the public to see. You see, this is the problem I have as a scientist. That's why I don't want to know what the exact number is. It doesn't even matter because I don't trust it. I honestly don't trust it. That 14.4 from Alberta Health Services, I haven't seen evidence that they have manipulated that number. We can only go to where we have seen the data. But I've seen over and over again, public health agencies, as we get these freedom of information requests, they are manipulating data and they are not disclosing the proper data to the public. It is not being transparently disclosed to the public. So that's why I personally like to try and avoid the numbers. And we can debate the numbers all we want, but at the end of the day, what's not debatable is when you see in black and white in front of your own eyes that they are manipulating numbers to deceive the public, our public health officials. This goes outside, this goes beyond the realm of science, right? We can't trust our public health officials. And that is why we can't be giving judicial notice to these organizations. Or, legacy media can't just be saying, well, Health Canada has said this, it's results. So these few people who disagree, clearly can't know what they're talking about because Health Canada says this. No, the BC Centre for Disease Control lied to British Columbians on this data, on the safety data, right? And so when that happens, we have to open the floor up to all discussions for the sake of the public. So that's what I'm saying is the numbers are debatable. The numbers, any which way you slice it, are concerning. But we don't even know what the full extent of the potential concern is based on those numbers because I have seen that I can't trust what our public health officials, the data that they're relaying to me.
Aren't you happy you have a supplemental question?
Actually, it fits in nicely. Please go ahead,
I'd like to go back and just supplement a little to your previous question about the immune system because, this can seem like a very hopeless situation. Someone's taking immune damaging injection and it has long-term effects. A couple of things stand out. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have a way to undo all the damages from these injections. We also know that not everybody got a fully functioning injection, partly because of the quality of manufacturing, partly because of how the injections were handled, and partly because we think there probably are unknown controls. So a lot of people got lucky. And I think people who said, yeah, I got a shot and I felt fine, well, that's probably a good sign. Because if your body starts producing foreign toxin, in response to tens of trillions of copies of genetic code, you should feel it. And a lot of people did feel rough after some of their injections. But the other thing with regards to the immune system and with regards to these injections, there are things we can do, and we see them working. One of the most interesting case last year is one of the really great heroic doctors in the world in the last 4 years has been Dr. Paul Merrick. Dr. Paul Merrick is an ICU specialist. Dr. Paul Merrick was one of the pioneers in treating severe cases of COVID. Again, for most people, COVID wasn't a severe disease. But some people that went to ICUs they had been denied early treatment that worked for most people. So Paul Merrick was advancing that treatment. The hospital also took 2 shots. Paul Merrick also was adversely affected. And Paul Merrick also has been at the cutting edge of treating the effects of the injections and developed, people can look at his work at the FLCCC. So here's a beautiful story, because we need some hope. but it has to be based on reality. We're not just going to make it up. Paul Merrick, and I'm not exposing this, he said this publicly before. He had type 2 diabetes, he was on multiple medications, had hypertension and triglyceride and cholesterol issues. So this is a good man who had serious health issues before COVID. Following the injections, he was badly injured. He began to research, what am I going to do about this for myself and for my patients? And by embarking on that journey, one of the interesting, now did he eliminate all the toxic effects in his body of the injections? I don't think so. Does he have long-term things we're going to still be concerned about? Sure. But on the other hand, in the process of the things he discovered, for instance, what he discovered about nutrition, what he discovered about the importance of fasting and intermittent fasting, was he actually resolved his type 2 diabetes, his dyslipidemia, and his hypertension is on no longer any medications. So those of us that have been locked out of our laboratories and our hospitals, we've been working very hard around the world, and we're learning a lot. So I think that this ultimately, we get to the other side of this hump politically. We restore the rule of law. We restore justice. We're going to have a level of healthcare that we've never had before. And with regards, I want people to know that if you've been injected, which a lot of us have, whether you go to my website, drjersey.org, or you go to the World Council for Health, or you go to the FLCCC, or any good resource, type in the word detox and get started, right? And there's not products so much to sell. I mean, there's simple natural supplements, there's repurposed medications, and there's nutritional things are huge. The other issue about the immune system, so yes, something has happened that's damaged people's immune systems. So let's do things that are good for our immune system, right? And so in that regard, I mentioned this last night. It's a very simple paradigm for people to remember. Remember the mnemonic, new start, N-E-W-S-T-A-R-T, nutrition. Eat a diet which is rich in organic foods. Eat a large variety of different plants of different colors. Get away from toxic foods. Get away from genetically modified food. Get away from glyphosate in your bread. Get away from sodium benzoate disrupting immune cells. Get back to eating natural, healthy food, nutrition. Exercise, that speaks for itself. Have an active lifestyle. Water, hydrate. Keep your body well hydrated. If you're not drinking 2 or 3 liters a day, you're underhydrated, right? Sunshine. Sunshine and vitamin D. There's no substitute for that. And vitamin D levels are chronically low in the world by nature. I recently published an interview with James Lumley, a doctor of chiropractor who became a member of parliament, and he pursued this issue. And if you see actually the corruption at the federal level that's suppressed, changing the government's requirements that you need 400 IUs a day. You need 400 IUs a day of vitamin D to keep your bones from falling apart. But to run your immune system, depending on how busy your immune system is working, you need thousands of units a day. And we knew that with, for instance, with COVID, people that had blood levels above a certain level had a 0 statistical risk of getting sick with COVID. We have studies from Alberta going back to the 90s that showed that people that had their vitamin D adequately supplemented to achieve optimal blood levels have a 75% lower risk of cancer. Like, think about how much disease can be cured with vitamin D. Big Pharma hates vitamin D for a reason. It'll put them out of business. So there's your sunshine and vitamin D. Temperance. Temperance refers to getting hot and getting cold. So simple as have a hot shower and finish it off with a 2-minute cold rinse. Now you can go much deeper into that, but there's a good start. A in START stands for air. Get fresh air, get outside, breathe fresh air, be around plants, go out in the forest, right? R stands for rest. Everybody knows sleep is a healer. And then T stands for trust. And that trust, if you look at the original group that started that paradigm, was a Christian group. They meant trust in God. But I think if you're a Buddhist or an atheist, and for yourself and for your children, make sure that their spiritual and psychological health is attended to. Unplug them from the devices that are screwing their minds up. Take them outside, talk to them, give them classic literature. So there are definitely things that we can do. And I'm optimistic that, like so many people, I know people, we all know people who had a major assault in their life. The person who got a major back injury and was crippled up and on crutches and taking pills, and after years of that they said, enough of this, I got to do something, and they went and they started studying yoga and they took up nutrition. And the bizarre thing is some of those people end up healthier than their peers. So I think we have plenty of reason for hope, but I think we have to be very serious, and I think we absolutely have to stop the injections, absolutely have to stop this this bioweapons research, gain of function research, making viruses that are more dangerous to humans. Who pays taxes for that? Nobody says, hey, government, I need you to make dangerous viruses and lock them in the lab and hope they don't get out. That's insane. So I just want to make sure that, there is hope for our children and for ourselves.
Thanks, Dr. Trozy.
Oh, that's great. I love that aspect of hope, and I almost hate to backtrack and go back and
That's okay.
up some of the
We're full
less
spectrum.
positive stuff, but just on.
Yeah,
I got what I'm going to.
Go for it.
So I'm struggling with this issue of the manipulation of data. And what would drive that exactly? So I understand what you talked about, the WHO, the World Health Organization, and their heavy influence, and how here in Canada we rejected what we domestically made as a pandemic preparedness plan. So what do you think is driving these doctors to write down, well, okay, died of a car accident, instead of saying died of COVID, and now with the vaccine injuries to say, oh, well, it's probably long COVID, it's probably not from the vaccine. Do you think that it's cognitive dissonance?
You lose your job, you lose your hospital privileges, and use your medical license.
Wow.
I mean, imagine,
Yeah.
you just have to submit one vaccine injury report and you will have an AHS manager or a director or an executive contacting you probably within 24 hours, maybe within a week. I've spoken to my colleagues. I spoke to a number of Alberta colleagues who submitted vaccine injury reports, and now they are under scrutiny, they are being threatened, and some of them are actually being investigated by the college. So it's a very simple
It's
answer.
incredible.
And I can speak to that directly. One of my clients when we were suing AHS on the vaccines was Dr. Gregory Chen. He had one vaccine injury report that he had to submit 3 times, and he still never got it done. He put hours and hours and hours of work into this. And it's just that, it's almost like the doctors, to get a vaccine injury report submitted, have to do the amount of work that we would do to win a case in small claims court. And doctors don't have the time for that. And that's the reality of it. That's why the figures are so skewed. The
Yeah.
system is designed to kick out the reports.
And that's why it's a 40, even when you have a good system, it's a 40-to-1 ratio. For the if there's 100 reports, it really represents 4,000 reports that should have been made. So if there's 100 deaths declared in a given month in a given country due to, indeed, the vax, it's not 100, it's 4,000. Because there is that diminution factor in a passive reporting system of this nature.
So an underreporting factor.
Yeah, and that's it. We don't have a clue what the underreporting factor is. So in Canada, it's CAFIS. It's the Canadian Adverse Events Following Immunization Surveillance Systems. Quite a mouthful. CAEFISS. Canadian Adverse Events Following Immunization Surveillance System. It's a passive system, so people voluntarily, report. And it's all I can tell you is it massively underrepresents the true number of medical events that have occurred following vaccination. We have no idea to what degree. That historical idea suggests it could be in the ballpark. People have different estimates. I've heard the 40 to 1. I've heard it under, there's it's a 100 to 1 underreporting ratio. But the point is, it's substantial. And this is what people need to understand. I saw leading up to this event, and some of the material that I saw, I would say sort of propaganda coming from state-funded media. There's these arguments that, oh, no, actually, I just remember where it is. So actually, it's interesting. In these communications that came from the BC Centre for Disease Control, when they were reporting the adverse event, they were trying to advise Bonnie Henry with what public messaging she could provide. And without providing any data whatsoever, they were reporting, so British Columbia had an increase in, at that point, very early, the first concern they had was with anaphylactic shock. And so, but they were saying, but we suspect there's over-reporting to the system because the media has publicized this fact. So we probably remember the first day of the rollout globally, anaphylaxis was first defined, but without providing any evidence. And I agree with everybody here. I'm a scientist who became known as somebody who's open to the idea that maybe these COVID shots aren't entirely safe and effective. And I've had thousands of people come to me with their stories, including physicians. I'll speak on behalf of the physicians. The stories you just heard, including from Jeff Rath, are 100% true. physicians are afraid. They've seen what happens to physicians who speak out or do anything against the narrative. Many aren't reporting because they're afraid. Others are not reporting because it's too onerous. So I know physicians in British Columbia who are working in the emergency ward, and the system they had to follow in their particular hospital would be 40 minutes. It would consume 40 minutes every time they wanted to do that. So if they had to file 5 reports, in theory, there's no way they could. So they just simply didn't take the time to do it. Most people, when they got the shot, I've seen this in court where the other side says, oh, well, legally everybody was, physicians were compelled to submit this. You've heard they haven't. If you've heard of one example, and you've heard many here, where it didn't happen, that's underreporting. By definition, it's underreporting, even if it's just one. So we have no idea how many. So most people were not told when they got the shot that if you experience any unusual medical event following the shot, you're to report it to your physician. Then the physicians, when those reports came from their patients, they were not supposed to make a determination themselves as to whether or not it was related to the shot. You can't make that determination when you're talking about something that's brand new. They were just simply supposed to send that to the local medical officer of health, that report. I know of many cases where the local medical officers of health then sent back the reports. They rejected them. I even have had people come to me and share with me the correspondence that was provided to their physician, where their physician was shocked because the medical officer of health sent back the report and actually asked them to change the diagnosis on that report, change that physician's own diagnosis. They take offense to that. And so we don't know how many times, but the ridiculous thing is medical officers of health were granted the authority to make their own determination, which is ridiculous, of whether or not it was related to the shot. So what a local medical officer of health would do is if they saw something come in and they saw, well, this seems unusual, I've never seen this with historical vaccines, and these things are nothing like traditional vaccine technologies, they'd say, this seems like an outlier, so it certainly can't be related. I'm not going to pass this on to the Public Health Agency of Canada. But what happens is, say there's a 1 in 1,000 event that happens in every jurisdiction across Canada. Now all of a sudden that CAFA system gets loaded up with these 1 in 1,000 events, and we now see a safety signal. So I'm just explaining to you, this is how the system worked. And that's why physicians were afraid. Some of them just simply couldn't submit it. So many of them didn't have patients report problems, and many of them couldn't afford the time, and they didn't want to get in trouble. And so I think, honestly, one of the biggest conversations we have to have in Canada, which would be an eye-opener, because then we would see that these things are not as safe as we've been told, is if we could actually get the data.
Yeah.
How many people, if we get an idea, how many people actually experienced unusual medical events but never reported it to their physician? How many physicians got the news that there was an unusual medical event but never submitted to the local medical officer of health? Compared to historical data with historical vaccines, what was the proportion of reports that were deemed inadmissible to the Public Health Agency of Canada with the COVID shots relative to historical vaccines? I would suspect there was probably an increase in the censorship of those reports. And then it would be very fascinating. And to tie it all together, what you have to remember is when it comes to the mentality here, Health Canada, you don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? And what Canadians need to understand is Health Canada's budget, by far and away, the majority of it used to historically come from tax dollars, right? But now the vast majority of the budget comes from the very pharmaceutical companies whose applications Health Canada is reviewing, right?
I just have a quick follow-on question, and it has to do with RSV specifically. Have any of you looked at, because reading all the propaganda leading up coming from the government with regard to this event, the government was saying, oh, well, there's all these unexplained causes. They're explained. We got a spike in RSV deaths, in children, we got a spike in influenza, whatever. These aren't unexplained deaths. I've read articles that indicate that RSV is a known side effect of the shots, and that the increase in RSV in children who've been vaccinated can be as much as 400%. My question is, have any of you looked at any data or considered the degree to which all of the RSV deaths in the last 2 years were due to the shots? Like, have we looked at any numbers, vaccinated versus unvaccinated RSV deaths?
No, see, we're starved of those data. We're starved of those objective data, but others here, including Mark Trozi, already indicated there's damage to the immune system, which can explain why people might be more susceptible to other diseases. And it was not, as an immunologist, I already earlier gave the explanation about how children need to be exposed, and Dr. Trozi had mentioned this as well. They need to interact. We all need to interact, but especially children, with their microbial environment if they want properly regulated immune systems. But with what you're saying, it's as simple as We locked the population down hard for about a year and a half. Remember, locked them down hard. We were not properly exposed to the microbial world. So then when we sent kids back to school, right, and back into all their social environments, and all of a sudden the world was all upset because what's happening is we have these adenoviruses, which usually just cause mild colds at most, causing issues in children. We have RSV causing problems in children, right? We have these other diseases that they're occurring more often and they're occurring with much greater severity. It was not a surprise at all to me as an immunologist. As I already mentioned, viruses are inherently prone to mutating. And if you isolate yourself from the microbial world, right, and these pathogens continue to mutate, what you're doing is now and then you expose yourself back, to that world. What you're doing is you're exposing yourself to viruses now for which your immune system is way out of date. It's as simple as that for the children. So yes, these shots are doing harm to their immune systems, which can explain it. But like I also said, we took kids and we basically put them a year and a half behind the world's pathogens. No wonder we had dramatic increases in the sickness of our children due to these other infectious diseases.
Do you think the powers that be, so to speak, might be more willing to talk about the effects of kids when it comes to the lockdowns and their immune system? Like Dr. Phil is going around doing his interview tour based on his book and really drawing attention to this issue about the kids being locked down and the effect on the immune system. Do you think because it's not so directly, it's related to the COVID vax, but a little bit removed, then that it's actually harmful to the kids? That people
you're right. It's one step removed from the politics.
Right.
Of COVID-19, because it applies to all these other infectious diseases. Yes, and absolutely, and that needs to be talked about, because if we really care about our children, we're not going to keep doing this to them every time there's a pandemic declared, or this is going to happen over and over and over again.
Interestingly enough, about our media conference today, which of course is 50 minutes over time, which is just like our event last night. We're 70% over, so if we're using numbers, so you can make of it what you will. I'm going to draw it to a close and allow people some one-on-one time with the doctors. The only reason that I'm saying that is that some of them are pressed for time to catch a plane, or we don't want to be missing things like that. But this has been a captivating opportunity for the last couple days, and for some of us, it's been going on for months of responding to questions, answers, accusations. But really, the conclusion that we would like you to understand is that we want to have the conversation, one conversation at a time. We want to make sure that we're having the conversation in a respectful and open way that creates an informed public. And maybe we're starting with informed politicians. If this was if the situation of unexplained deaths in children was simply an issue of science, we wouldn't need to have an injection of truth. We would have had a conclusion made already. But it doesn't seem to be just about the science. In fact, when it comes to the opposition, whatever that opposition looks like, I know who he looks like because I've been, personally accused of many things by him. There's no facts on the other side. There's no facts that are being relayed by public health. There are no facts and data. So if there's no facts and data, there can't be a problem. And if there's no problem, why is there action being taken to create a problem? And that's what I'd like to draw. I'd like to thank Eric Bouchard, MLA. I'd like to thank our esteemed panel of scientists. I'd like to thank Jeffrey Rath and Sean Newman from last night for making themselves available. And again, they receive no compensation to be a part of what we're doing. They simply want to break the silence and allow for the dialogue to occur. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Can I get a picture?
Sure.
Thank you all again for coming out.